Hello and welcome to today's RIMS webinar sponsored by Sued Global Risk Consultants, Property Valuations Amid Record Inflation. I am Justin Smolison, Business Content Manager here at RIMS, the Risk and Insurance Management Society. A few notes before we begin. If you have a question for the presenters during today's session, please submit them by writing in the question box. Feel free to ask at any point in the presentation. We will reserve time at the end for Q&A. Following this session, the recording will be available through the on-demand events page of rims.org. All downloads and contact information will be accessible to the sponsor. And also, folks, RIMS is hosting Risk World in Atlanta, Georgia from April 30th through May 3rd, and we are thrilled to have Sued on the expo floor. You can find them in booth 841, and they have an expanded presence because they are sponsoring our global studio. We are so happy about that, and we want to see you there, so register at rims.org/riskworld. And on with today's presentation. Record inflation has sent prices soaring. One study has found that 60% of buildings and 40% of equipment is now undervalued. The current landscape makes it harder than ever to establish insurable values, loss estimates, and risk models. In today's session, our panelists will discuss how to establish credible insurable values through benchmarking and on-site appraisals, how to avoid common yet overlooked mistakes in the valuation process, and more. RIMS is thrilled to welcome a large global audience, and now I will hand it off to our moderator, my friend, Jared Shelley.
Hey, thanks, Justin, for that great intro. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Property Valuations Amid Record Inflation. As Justin said, my name is Jared Shelley, and I'm Head of Marketing for Sued Global Risk Consultants. Today, we're talking about property valuations. Skyrocketing inflation has drastically changed the value of insured assets like property and equipment. Commercial properties may be undervalued by 30% for underwriting purposes, and construction inflation has been between 12% and 40% per year since the pandemic. Meanwhile, losses are trending higher due to inflation. Getting values correct is critical, with downstream effects for accurate loss estimates and risk modeling. Plus, the hard market has created heightened scrutiny of estimated property values. Underwriters need detailed property valuation data to entertain new risks and renew existing policies. It all adds up to companies being drastically underinsured, leading to reduced claims that won't pay for replacement costs and rebuilding expenses. The market conditions make it critical to get accurate valuations of property and equipment, and increases the need for independent valuations. In today's webinar, we will discuss the issue with some of the best minds in the industry. Ray Walsh is Vice President and Regional Underwriting Manager for StarTech, part of Star Insurance Companies. He has deep underwriting expertise in industries like power generation, chemicals, and semiconductor technology. Justin Chen is Global Manager for Property Valuation Services at Sued GRC. He previously spent 15 years as a property valuation specialist with Zurich. David Ricks is Global Sales Manager at Sued GRC. He previously held leadership roles with Marsh and Willis. So here's what we're going to discuss today. Establishing credible insurable values through benchmarking and on-site appraisals, understanding how inflation has affected insured asset valuations, learning how underwriters assess asset valuations, learning how valuation specialists like Justin examine large portfolios, explaining on-site versus desktop valuations, and avoiding common yet overlooked mistakes in the valuation process. So here's how the webinar will run. I'll serve as the moderator, asking questions to our panelists. If you have a question of your own, please use the question box on your screen and ask anything you'd like. We really want this to be interactive, so please get your questions in, and we'll answer them at the end of our presentation. Now, let's go to the first question from me. And set the current landscape in property valuations. How has inflation from the past few years affected insured asset valuations? Justin, would you like to take this one?
Yep, thanks, Jared. So typically we're used to seeing that 2 to 4% increase in values that you can apply to both the construction, the real property side, and the machinery equipment side. These last 3 years has kind of thrown a wrench in those trends. COVID was one of the main factors, and then we're still seeing residual effects from COVID. In the construction industry, we've seen a big increase since 2020, about a 40% increase in values in construction projects. The good news is that machinery equipment hasn't seen those big jumps, but we're still seeing those jumps in values of about 13% since 2020. And then this past year, we've seen about a 6% increase. Again, one of the reasons of that is because of COVID and the residual effects. So during COVID, we saw a lot of construction, the labor market kind of retire. And now that the construction projects are starting to come back, we have this labor shortage, a high demand in labor, high skilled workers, and not enough people to fill those jobs. And a lot of those journeymen had actually retired, and now it's harder to train some of these new employees coming into the construction industry. Another issue, I'm sure we're all still seeing it today, supply chain issues. That's causing increase in transportation costs, things like that, that directly affects the construction and machinery equipment side of values. Another thing would be the tariffs on imported goods. There's always pressure from our government to have tariffs and things like that are all kind of downflow into our products here in the U.S. So, with all these pressures, we're seeing a high increase in construction costs and machinery equipment costs. It is starting to stabilize a bit, but I don't see it going back to pre-COVID times. So, we'll have to figure out a way to adjust and figure out how to tackle this problem with, increase in replacement cost values and the pressure in property rates.
And David, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Justin is really referring to has caused values to increase more rapidly than most insureds can appropriately adjust. And for many, it just hasn't been that easy to simply use trending. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I think the other thing that you're seeing is that the insurance market is suffering losses that are out of proportion with the premiums charged, as the valuations are increasing more rapidly than they can be declared to the marketplace. So that can be a real issue. We're really seeing this across all industries. I think it's pretty much affected everybody. A couple stand out, though. Certainly the food and beverage industry, we've seen a pretty significant influx of work of all shapes and sizes in that sector. Processing industries, similarly. I think anything where it can be very challenging, where you've got situations where you have aging equipment, older processes, that can create unique challenges from the standpoint of establishing replacement cost. Let's say the other thing that maybe stands out that's a bit noteworthy is that we see valuation work coming in, particularly from programs that have been placed 100% in the marketplace with a monoline carrier for many years. Typically, those values need to be scrutinized pretty heavily. In many cases, they also need to have a better breakdown of assets at key locations. You might just have one row for a very, very large location, and that just really doesn't cut it anymore. So a lot of the work that Justin's team is doing is to help clients really break out the asset detail for larger locations where there's more than one thing going on. So that's all I've got. Jared, back to you.
Thanks, David. Ray, let's go to you now. How do underwriters assess valuations?
Well, the first thing the underwriter wants to know is who's performing the valuation. Are they a reputable source for completing valuations for the type of property they've agreed to assess? What have they assessed that's is what they've assessed? Is it relevant to what the underwriter is asking for? For example, if you have a schedule of 200 locations and they've completed a dozen valuations, are those dozen valuations the ones that are going to be most helpful to the underwriter? The key locations, the ones with the greatest values, that are going to have the greatest impact on the program.
Yeah, well, so what do you look for specifically?
Well, we want to make sure the valuation is being done on a replacement cost basis, first and foremost. Most policies are providing coverage on that basis. And so replacement cost is important. A lot of insureds will often assume that the market value of a property is what it should be insured for. So that we acquired this property for X, But in fact, when you look at the replacement costs, particularly for real estate, the cost of replacing that facility may be 2x. And so it's the replacement cost that really needs to be reported here, because that's the way that the policy is usually covering that property.
Great, thanks, Ray. And Justin, explain your process when you dig into a large portfolio.
Yep. So with a large portfolio, we don't want to spend all our time trying to look at for all the different locations. We don't have the resources or the money to be able to look at each location and examine it. So typically what we do is we look at, we ask for the statement of values, and we need occupancy and square footage. That really drives the values. We typically look at just the building values because it's the easier thing to come up with the dollars per square foot. They're very standard typically, whereas machinery equipment, it really depends on density of equipment and the type of equipment that's being put into those facilities. We do have some benchmarking and dollars per square foot for machinery equipment, but on that initial looking at large portfolios, we look at the building values and dollars per square foot. So typically we'll do that dollars per square foot based on occupancy and square footage, and just look for red flags compared to our in-house benchmarking numbers, things that we've developed through these, 10, 20, 30 years of doing appraisals. So we kind of know where building values should fall, and they're adjusted to today's rates. So what we look for is those discrepancies and ask questions. We're not looking to say we're developing our values through this exercise, but we're trying to identify those red flags and ask questions. Maybe the square footage is wrong. Maybe it's a different kind of building, and you just examine it and just ask questions. And then you decide from there, what are the next steps? Are we going to do a deeper dive into a desktop valuation, or even, boots on the ground and doing an on-site valuation where we're actually there and can actually see everything that's at the location?
Great, thanks, Justin. David, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just to add to Justin there, when you get to that stage on these large portfolios, just really developing a well thought out strategy is key. And you've got to start early in this process. It may involve a hybrid approach, as Justin alluded to, with a combination of some desktop and some site work. But developing that methodology, getting buy-in from the key stakeholders, getting help from your broker, all of that's going to be really key. I think the other thing that we see, a lot of factors that go into this strategy, Justin obviously mentioned the occupancy, but looking at the time since the last valuations were done, or what's the most recent appraisal, do you have a need for further breakdown of assets on the schedule for certain types of occupancies? That can be very important in this marketplace to put your risk profile in the best possible light through further breakdown. Some clients actually are fortunate where they've had some recent capital projects that can give them a good basis for very similar assets. So that can be very beneficial for some. But I guess maybe most importantly, and this is something that Justin would look at very carefully when he's looking at the methodology in conjunction with the client, how many resources do they have at the site level to support the project? Folks who are knowledgeable on those assets, that know the location, that know what's involved to replace key equipment. That's really, really important. So getting an understanding within your organization as to who can you access for that type of detail is critical. So many clients with large portfolios are going to start with their higher value locations. Of course, makes sense. Maybe those with higher loss expectancies as well. But I just can't stress enough, particularly on the large schedules, to start early. We've seen this. It's a multi-year process for many insureds to get this right and develop a process that can be ongoing and sustainable.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Go ahead. Oh, thanks, guys. So also just want to remind the audience to get your questions in. We're already seeing some really good questions come through. So please get your questions in. We want to have a nice lively Q&A session at the end. So this question goes now to Justin. Some assessments can be done on site, others can be done via desktop. How do you decide which one to do and which one might be most effective?
Right. So it really depends on the complexity, the scope of work, and how accurate you want the valuation to be. So with a desktop valuation, with buildings, it's a little, again, it's kind of like that, looking at a large portfolio. Buildings are easier, they're standard, and it's easier to do like a building valuation by desktop. We can still do machinery equipment, but it really relies on the client to give us a good asset listing that is reliable and has good data in it, and then we'll use that data to, I guess, use indices and indexes to trend our historical costs to today's replacement cost values. So that's kind of the desktop version. It's very, I guess, it's quick. And I guess with technology today, we have satellite imagery. We can use Google Earth to kind of measure square footages if those aren't provided. We can look at buildings through satellite imagery, and that really is a good way of doing at least desktop and buildings. Again, machinery equipment is a little bit hit or miss, but there's ways to do it. Our on-site valuations are kind of our bread and butter. It's the most accurate. We go to the site, boots on the ground, and we ask for a lot of details about buildings. We can see the buildings. We'll take photos of the buildings and capture the data for building materials, if it's sprinklered, and then just identifying what is actually there. On the machinery equipment side, we'll do inventorying of equipment. So we'll walk through the whole plant and try to capture everything. For like systems and production equipment, we'll sit down with plant managers and talk about those systems. We'll talk about the machine itself, installation costs, taxes, freight and installation, engineering costs, everything that would encompass basically putting the system back as is. And so they can go back to going to business if there was any kind of claim.
Great, thanks, Justin. Let's go to Ray here. Do underwriters have a preference for desktop versus on-site?
Yeah, I mean, we generally prefer on-site valuations if given an appraisal that's on-site versus a desktop. There's just more certainty that's provided in the on-site because somebody's physically been to the facility. Justin mentioned, what's the square footage? Is that right? The inventory of equipment and machinery. The on-site is especially important if you have a lot of machinery involved at the facility to really to encompass all of those details. Underwriters do have access to valuation tools like Marshall and Swift. We use those for spot checking of values, particularly building values, or based on square footage for machinery. There might be an index that we can use. So we have these basic tools for valuation, but that's really just for spot checking. We're not going to go through a schedule of 200 locations and do a detailed valuation on that, certainly on a desktop basis. So that's where the desktop valuations become valuable to us. If you have somebody like Justin who's going out there and it's a large schedule, it's a lot of locations, and he's providing that desktop valuation, and that's something that's available to the underwriters, that's definitely a value to us. And so there's really, both on-site and desktop have their purposes.
Ray, is occupancy a factor?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be more important for manufacturers. If they're manufacturing something, again, I mentioned that machinery can be an important thing for an on-site valuation. This can include refineries, power generation facilities, mining facilities, high-tech facilities. Also, if there's anything unique about the facility, like it's a historical building or it's an unconventional construction or located in an unusual location, those are all things that an on-site appraisal is going to give more certainty to the underwriter about what it is that we're insuring.
Absolutely. And so how recent should property valuations be?
Ordinarily, I'd say, maybe once every 5 years, if you have a normal inflation environment where you're 2% or 4%, something like that, every fifth year might be a good frequency. But in this current environment, I would say you want to bring that down to maybe every 3 years on your critical locations, because values are simply changing that rapidly. It's very hard to stay on top of it. And the valuations are really thinking about the local environment and all of the local impacts on that environment. So I would say in this environment, every 3 years, something a bit more stable, maybe every 5.
And Justin, do you agree with that? Every 3 years about?
Yeah, I would say every 3 to 5 years. Basically, what you want to do is create that baseline of value, so you know that base value, and then you can do some trending between those 3 to 5 years using those indexes that we talked about earlier. And trending is a good way to kind of keep up to date, but you also have to know its downsides. You need to know what the index represents and if it matches well with your assets. For example, if you're having an index for a building that is mostly concrete, but that index represents a lot of steel, your numbers are going to be off. You're using an index that doesn't closely match your assets, so it's not going to be a good update for that next year and replacement cost values.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Ray again. So what happens if a company is underinsured and has a sizable claim?
Well, first and foremost, they run the risk of receiving only a partial recovery of the loss. And that's adding financial stress during a time already in a difficult situation. So it's really the last thing that you want to have happen as an insured, and as an insurer, we don't want to see that either. In tightening insurance markets like the one we're in, particularly one where you've had some loss activity, which has been an issue, underwriters become less willing to waive co-insurance. So they're really going to insist on, seeing that the values are appropriate, and that they want to see those valuations, real attention to that, because that's kind of underwriting 101. That you get your exposures right first, and then everything else from there is underwriting goes a lot better. When we have concerns about the values being reported, we'll oftentimes apply an occurrence limit of liability endorsement, and that's going to limit recovery to the stated value of the property on the statement of values, and that can be a significant restriction on the coverage. So clients want to get these values right. I know it's frustrating for clients when you have the indexes that track this stuff saying, hey, you've got a 10 or 20% increase year over year on the cost of your values. And as frustrating as that is, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you've got appropriate coverage. You don't want to be caught short, because again, when that loss happens, it's happening at a time when you are already going through some really difficult things because of the loss. So you don't want to be caught short financially.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Justin, let's go to you. In some cases, replacement costs might be tricky, right? Because you might not want to replace the facility in the same way. Rather than rebuilding a smokestack, for example, you may have a more modern way to emit smoke. How do you determine replacement costs as is, or determine the cost of a newer technology, which would actually be what's being replaced?
Right. So the property policy says replacement cost new, which is replacing your asset with like kind and quality. There are cases when that technology or that asset is no longer available, or that technology is gone. So, we have to have that discussion, especially when we're on site or we identify that asset is out of date. So we'll sit down with someone knowledgeable and discuss what would replace that machine, and if there's any issues with replacing it with something new, with newer technology. For example, there's times when you have that partial loss, you lose one machine, and the only machine that will replace it is something newer, faster, and basically better in all ways. But will it fit in that production line, or do you have to have added costs because you're trying to time it correctly, or try to kind of fit something in a square peg in a round hole? So you have these issues that come up, and so you have to discuss them and figure things out. There's times when in the policy you get grandfathered into the newer technology. For example, like an MRI machine, a half Tesla machine, they don't make those anymore. So you would be upgraded to a 1 Tesla or a 2 Tesla machine to today's standards.
Great, thanks, Justin. So Ray, Justin, maybe go to Ray first. What are some common issues or mistakes to avoid when determining insurable values?
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake is thinking that the market value or the acquisition cost of the property is the amount that you should report. You really need to focus on replacement cost. For equipment, since policies are usually providing a replacement with like in kind, as Justin mentioned, you can make a case there for reporting at the current cost to acquire, but you really want to know that you can acquire it at that cost. You may have gotten a particularly good deal on a particular acquisition. That's why you pulled the trigger on it. But that doesn't mean that that's the available, that you can always get that piece of equipment at that cost. So you want to make sure that, what's a reasonable figure for what your replacement cost should be on your machinery and equipment. And then for real estate, it has to be replacement cost. You really need to be attentive to that. Again, regional factors can have an impact on that. And appraisals really do the best job of confirming that for the benefit of the underwriters and for the insureds.
And Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, so Ray did mention most of the common mistakes, but I'd like to say, there's so many different types of values that's difficult for everyone to think about replacement cost value. At a client's location, no one's actually developing replacement cost value. You have the financial experts, they're worried more about tax purposes, depreciating the value to report every year for taxes. So no one's actually developing replacement cost value. So, they're looking at their asset listings, acquisition value, using indices to come up with that replacement cost value without really understanding what that value represents. So again, you just need to make sure you're reporting that replacement cost value and understanding where it's coming from. Using that fundamental question is how you developing your replacement cost values.
Great, thanks, guys. This is really great. Really appreciate everybody's insight here. Let's go to another question. This again for Ray and Justin. Maybe start with Ray again. If inflation stabilizes, how might that change property valuations, premiums, and insurable values? Nothing to worry about anymore?
Your underwriters are always looking to establish the correct exposure base before applying a rate. That's the first rule, right? We're just trying to get the right exposure base. When inflation is tamer, the year-over-year changes tend to be less of an impact. But a good underwriter is always going to be asking what the values are and how they've been trended, and whether it's been trended to an appropriate index, because by industry. For power generation, for example, to take one out of there, Handy Whitman is an index that we often use for power generation. Is widely recognized by underwriters as an index that we like to use for trending those values. But here's the thing: premiums are not just a function of inflation. Higher inflation does, of course, have an impact on premiums because you have to take your values up more. So that's going to, it's a kind of a one-for-one impact. The other things that can have an impact on premiums can be the experience, the capacity in the marketplace, kind of the supply and demand. Those are things that also are going to have an impact on pricing and premiums, and they don't always follow the rate of inflation.
Justin, your thoughts?
Yep. It's kind of what Ray said, even though, right now we're going through this huge inflation spike and everyone's a little bit worried about replacement cost values and how to get coverage for it, you still need to create that baseline replacement cost value. It's always, one of the fundamental things of insurance is creating that baseline. You have the value, you have rate, and then you have engineering or your risk. So you always need to look at all of those, or look at those factors. But even though inflation is going up, or if it stabilizes, you still want that baseline value and figuring out how to adjust that every year.
Great. And as companies work on sustainability efforts, with solar panels and other equipment, does that change the equation for valuations, right?
The thing that when you're doing upgrades, you want to make sure that you're updating your values based on those changes. So if you add solar panels to your facility, you want to make sure that you're reflecting that in your statement of values, and not forget to include that, because those are costs that will need to be addressed there's a loss and you have to replace all those things as you change. When an engineering report mentions the new addition of equipment, for example, and the underwriter is looking at the statement of values and they don't see any change in the facility values, that's going to be a red flag for the underwriter. In a market like this, you don't want to create that red flag. You really want to be attentive to making sure that any upgrades that you're making, that you're reflecting that. Not all upgrades add to the cost. Sometimes it's just a function of you need to replace the roof, you need to replace the HVAC system or something along those lines. That may not add to cost, but certainly if you're adding anything, and solar panels would be one of those things, you want to make sure that you're reporting those in your values.
Great. David, going to go to you now. Can you explain how GRC would handle a property valuation and benefits that our clients might get?
Sure. So maybe just some background. We really got into the valuation business a number of years ago as an additional service to our loss control clients. It became evident in certain cases that values didn't look accurate, and that would therefore drive inaccurate loss expectancy. And that's really our core business. So Justin's team has certainly grown over the years. And with the current market environment, we certainly are seeing a significant influx of work. The other cautionary thing I'd mentioned to the audience, and once again, kind of starting early, there is, and I know we wouldn't be alone in this regard, a significant amount of demand for this work right now. So that can be really key. But we start with the SOV, the current SOV, and really start with that. Any other available information on the assets, certainly risk engineering reports that are available can be helpful to Justin. But really the initial call that we do to talk about scope and methodology and timing, talked about that in the onset, to really what is the strategy around the project. Really nailing that down is going to be key. Understanding your internal resources, as we discussed, is important. And so on that basis, we develop a proposal. The ultimate goal is to really tailor it to what the client needs. So many of these are no one size fits all. It's really important to tailor it to the specific needs of the client based on many factors, as we discussed. And at the end of the day, what you really want is a fair assessment of replacement costs for that particular client. And that's really only possible, at least in our experience, when we have a lot of great interaction and coordination with the client themselves. I mean, they know their business better than anyone, certainly the equipment that's in it, et cetera. So good partnership and good teamwork is going to be absolutely critical to the success of this.
Great. Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. We're going to go to Q&A in just a minute. So if you have any more questions, please get them in. There's plenty of great ones so far. So, we're all ears for your questions. And just want to give a quick recap. David, would you like to handle that?
Sure, we've covered a lot of this already, but I can't reiterate it enough to really work very deliberately on developing a strategy to not only update your values, but how you're going to continue to maintain them going forward in this environment. Involving your stakeholders, as I've mentioned, and really being cognizant of timing, depending on the size and complexity of your schedule. A lot of work goes into weighing the pros and cons, and budgets and cost issues certainly play into this. So that can be very important to engage management early on to go through that process. As the team has already mentioned, if you can understand the basis of your current valuations, that's a great start. And then probably most importantly for many clients, when they know that they have issues here, what is the potential impact of the revised values, and sort of playing that story forward, understanding how we're going to react or respond and mitigate any unpleasant surprises, if you will. So preparing for that outcome is key. And then obviously you're going to get a lot of questions from Ray and other underwriters throughout the renewal process. So being prepared to answer those is obviously critical.
That's right. So questions, we have a bunch. We're ready to start providing some answers. While we provide answers, I'm going to leave this slide on the screen. It's got our contact information. Also, we will be at Risk World, the RIMS conference, booth 841. We'd love to see you. Come chat with us. So I'll leave this up here while we do our Q&A. So let's get to the first question. This comes from James. How likely is it that risk managers will now consider something other than replacement cost values, given the rapid inflation of those values and current consideration of not rebuilding to current state in the event of a total loss. Anybody want to take that? I can pop it in the chat if it makes it easier for you guys.
Yeah, I think this is right. Just thinking about that, I think there's really not another way that you can consider this. I think that risk managers, if they want to have insurance as a risk transfer medium, then they really need to insure to the replacement cost value. I don't really see a way around that. I mean, I've seen in the past when things get tight that clients will look at or ask for actual cash value as a replacement method. The problem with actual cash value is a couple of things. But first and foremost, the biggest issue is that most losses are partial losses. They're not total losses of your facility. So as an insurer, when you're trying to insure something on an actual cash value and you have a partial loss, well, you're not going to tear down the building over a partial loss. Certainly not something that's minor. And so at the end of the day, you wind up paying replacement cost for that smaller loss. And so it's, as an underwriter, it's just not really a great practice to agree to do actual cash value unless it's something like machinery and equipment, something where they in fact don't intend to replace it, and it's something that is itemized in a way so that a partial loss basically is the loss. So I think there's a real challenge in choosing not to utilize replacement costs. Certainly insurers are not going to be keen to go that route.
Okay, good. This next question comes from Rosa. I feel like we got this maybe further into the presentation, but Rosa asks, how can you get accurate replacement costs?
I guess I can take that. I mean, that's kind of what we do in the valuation sector is try to come up with those accurate replacement costs, be it desktop or onsite. And a lot of it is, if we do the onsite, we follow the trends, we follow, how much a building should replace, and we create these models. So we kind of use a unitary cost approach where we're building up that building with construction cost information to replace that value. And then with the machinery equipment, it is those discussions with plant personnel. Okay, one, we have just the machinery cost, but then you have installation, you have timing, engineering, all these other things that go into that replacement cost. So we're doing our best to try to come up with that most accurate replacement cost at a facility.
Absolutely. And let's go to another question. Let's see, this one comes from Andrea. What is your threshold for large, quote, large portfolio? We use that term a bunch here.
Well, I mean, I guess I could just say, it's going to depend on the underwriting facility that's looking at it. A large portfolio, for Star, where we are, once you get to $100 million, that now you're starting to get into the area where we might have a decent sized portfolio. There's a lot of companies that have different cutoffs for that. It might be 250 million, it might be $1 billion. But if you have 100 million or more, I would say you probably have yourself what might fall into the category of a large portfolio.
And I don't know if this was in reference to, I guess, examining a large portfolio, but we can do that like high level dollars per square foot for any size portfolio, as long as we have that information of square footage and occupancy, and then we can do that dollars per square foot. And I know underwriters do it as well, where they'll just do that dollars per square foot, and it's easy to identify some of the big swings or the red flags. You can't build anything for $20 a square foot, or you find those things really quickly.
Hey, thanks, guys. Lots more to get to. Francis asks, what's the best approach for benchmarking or validating contents values?
I guess the approach, if you want to do like a benchmarking or desktop kind of validation of contents, I would say using that asset listing and knowing what is being captured in an asset listing, and making sure you're getting the acquisition date, acquisition cost, and a decent index. And that way you can kind of come up with what the facility should be replaced at. I guess we do have some in-house data where we have dollars per square foot for some of the contents. Again, that's difficult to come up with because it really depends on the density of equipment and the type of facility and how much manufacturing there is compared to warehousing or something like that. So if you have a 30% warehousing facility and a 70% manufacturing, your dollars per square foot is going to be much higher compared to, let's say, a 40% manufacturing and a 60% warehousing facility. So it's just understanding that stuff. And if there's ways to break up that type of facility by warehousing, manufacturing, office, you can apply different dollars per square foot and come up with, I guess, a more representable dollars per square foot for the full facility.
Terrific. Here's another question. For new construction projects that may not have an appraisal that includes replacement costs, what can you use to accurately evaluate the RCV of the new finished building?
So usually when you have a new construction project, there's a architect institute that the architect provides you kind of an invoice, and it's usually, I think it's usually a monthly basis, and it will detail what the costs are for that building. So I'll say, okay, it's in master format, and they'll say, okay, your concrete costs this much for material, this much for labor, and et cetera, for the full project. And you can examine that, take out the soft costs, and then use indices to come up with a good value. It actually is, whenever we go to a facility, we always ask about new construction projects if they have that AIA document to help us out with those building values, because those are real world costs and probably the most accurate way of coming up with replacement costs for an actual building. So I would say if it's possible to get that documentation and then examine it, and then, you know, make adjustments to come up with what you should report for replacement cost.
Okay, great. Here's a good question from Michelle, very specific. If you have a property that was appraised within the last 10 years, but has recently undergone a moderate to significant renovation, what is the best way to capture the new building value accurately? Generally, the renovation cost is more costly per square foot than if you were to build from scratch. Is there a reasonable way to take this into consideration? I'll pop this in the chat, guys, because I know it's a little bit of a longer question.
Yeah. So again, I guess in my shoes, we would ask for the renovation cost, dollars per square foot, what went into the renovation, take out the demolition costs, and then just understanding, you know, okay, if we have a renovation cost, we can figure out the dollars per square foot for carpet, the dollars per square foot for the gypsum board, things like that. If it was on a, I guess, normal building schedule, you weren't paying overtime, all these other things. And then we would compare it to kind of our in-house databases and say, okay, we know how much this square foot for gypsum board, but, you know, and you just try to, I guess, piece it together and do your best to say, okay, these are the special conditions and this is why it costs more. And you try to take those out and come up with the conditions that would happen if there was like a total loss or a partial loss for that area.
Great. Next question is from Lisa. How do underwriters view using price per square foot based on current projects or additions to existing locations?
I'm sorry, ask that question one more time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, how do underwriters view using price per square foot based on current projects, parentheses, additions to existing locations?
You know, I think we're always looking at it on the, you know, the whole facility, right? So when you make additions to a facility, as Justin mentioned, those additions can sometimes be more expensive than if you were to build it from scratch. So, you know, we're always stepping back and looking at those valuation tools we have access to. Again, this is easier for real estate than it is for machinery and equipment. Look at what the cost would be to replace the building in total. So, you know, last year was 100,000 square foot facility. You did a $50,000 or 50,000 square foot addition, and it cost X amount. Our focus is really trying to keep the eye on the replacement cost if we had the facility engaged in a total loss. What would that look like? One of the reasons that's so important for us, the reason we're so focused on that, is because we're also trying to figure out what is our maximum exposure for the facility. So if we know, and so you might say, well, most losses are partial losses, so why do you pay so much to a total loss? And that's because we're trying to limit our exposure to a loss at the facility. And so we'll always look at it from that standpoint of what is the total replacement cost of the facility. So that's how we go about it.
I'll add to that. Let's just say you have a partial loss on a building, and you had to repair it. Typically, it costs more than replacement cost because you're trying to match materials to the existing buildings. You want to get back up into business, so you're paying those bonuses for overtime. All these, I guess, special conditions in those partial loss scenarios. So you have to consider that when I guess that's one of the reasons why partial loss scenarios are cost more than replacement cost.
Great. So many good questions here. So let's keep rolling. Alexandra asks, do you have a methodology for creating correct actual cash value limits?
I'm going to let Justin jump on that one.
Yeah, actual cash value is a little bit more difficult. I guess you would have to have a discussion with the client on how they want to develop it. You can use a straight line method, or you can use other methods to do it. But or you can use like a lifespan type of depreciation, but it's basically, actual cash value is replacement cost minus depreciation. Well, then you have to figure out what the depreciation is, and then if you have to add anything back into it if you do any repairs or regular maintenance to that machine. So it really depends, and you have to talk with the client on how they want to address that, and maybe even each asset would have a different method of actual cash value, of developing an actual cash value.
Here's a question from Carlos. This is directed to you, Justin. You mentioned that when underwriting or assessing values, you look for red flags. Can you expand on what red flags are the most common and critical when for underwriting?
Yep. So when we're doing that high level, what we call a service profile, that dollars per square foot, we look for those outliers. We have our in-house benchmarking saying, okay, a manufacturing building should cost $100 to $130 a square foot. But if we see $50, $30, those are our red flags to ask questions. And again, we don't use it to develop values, but to ask questions saying, okay, we expect it to be 100, you're reporting 30. What is the reasoning? Do we have the square footage wrong? Do we have the occupancy wrong? Is there a special condition that we're missing? And you just have this interaction with the client and saying, we're identifying this issue. Let's just have a discussion about it.
Yeah, I'd like to, Jared, just that one of the first things we'll do when they get a large schedule of stations is, they'll take the values for the buildings in particular, and then the square footage, and then they'll just run a quick calculation, the price per square foot, if that's not already sitting in the statement of values, and then look for those outliers. And when they see the outliers, then they start asking questions. Well, how did you arrive at those valuations? And what is your methodology for valuations across the larger portfolio? Any anomalies are going to inspire more questions on the part of underwriters. We're just trying to get the exposure base right. And so it's not unlike what Justin would do when he sits down with that schedule to look at it at first. We just aren't doing as deep a dive and asking the client to go to somebody like Justin to really validate if they've got something that doesn't look quite what we would expect.
Great, thanks, Ray, and thanks, Justin. So a couple more questions here. Hang in with us. There's some good ones left here. Brandon, he asks, what recommended sources or trend indexes do GRC and underwriters recommend that risk managers reference as they start their valuation review?
Well, I mentioned for power generation, Handy Whitman, for example, there are indexes that exist for specific industries. you just want to try to get the one that the closest, matches most closely with the values that you're dealing with. Real estate is probably the easiest because you have, CoreLogic or Marshall and Swift that's pretty widely accepted. I think it's the machinery equipment is where it tends to get a bit more specialized. And so we want to start looking for indexes that are focused on that particular industry, so that you get values that are year over year, just matching what's happening in that particular industry.
And I would talk to your broker or your carrier as well to see if they have any cost trends available. I know some carriers produce their own cost trends, and they should be able to help out with that. There's some things online that you can find. Construction's side is like Mortensen. I think RS Means has a public one, and there's some other ones that you can kind of reference.
Great info, guys. Laurent asks, do you know of resources about valuation of specific assets for which dollars per square foot is not meaningful? I'll use a feed mill as an example with various parts, such as rail cars, receiving buildings, or silos that are more about capacity than square footage.
Yeah, so for certain industries, we do kind of look at it per, I guess, production capacity or something like that. And again, it's more of just trying to come up with, I guess, to ask those questions or create those red flags. So we're not trying to develop the values, but we're trying to see if it fits within a certain benchmark and if it seems reasonable. So for example, like waste treatment facilities, most of the time they're all small buildings, things like that. So you can't use square footage. So sometimes we'll use gallons per day, gallons per hour, something like that to come up with a dollars per gallon or something like that, instead of that dollars per square foot, to see if it falls within those guidelines. So instead of square footage, we'll ask, okay, how many gallons per day can you process, and use that information to ask questions. As far as like a feed mill, it'd probably be how much flour can you process per day, something like that.
Yeah, Jared, you asked earlier a question about functional replacement costs, and this is one of those areas where a lot of times you have a facility that's making something or a process that's a part of the facility that you wouldn't replace, what's already there. You would actually, because of changes in technology, you would use a completely different process, or you might use some different materials. And so your functional replacement cost could be quite a bit lower than what it is as it was built, and if you were trying to replace what's there. So just have a conversation with your underwriter about that when you think you have a situation where functional replacement costs would be quite a bit lower, and they can usually do something in terms of the way the coverage is afforded so that you're addressing that issue.
Right. And I've had that question a lot, that functional replacement cost, and sometimes it's difficult to answer because, again, what happens in that partial loss scenario? You lose one machine out of the whole line. Now I guess your exposure is completely different than what you were thinking would be. You're thinking full loss versus that partial loss.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a couple more questions. We're going to do our very best to get to everybody. And so hang in there. Andrea asks, do you see a significant gap in values when performing an on-site versus desktop evaluation? I feel like on-sites come out generally higher than desktop.
There can be significant gaps because we're gathering better, I would say, more accurate or better information when we're on site because we're actually seeing the assets. When you're doing desktop, if you don't get all the answers that you need to do a good valuation, it makes it a little bit difficult to come up with accurate values. So sometimes you're relying on satellite photos or again, the asset listings. So in the asset listing, maybe they bought the machine for a market value. So you're indexing a market value versus replacement cost value. So it really depends on what kind of information is coming in for those desktops and how you address those. And what we do in that machinery and equipment world is, at a certain threshold, we don't ask many questions. We just directly index. But for things over a certain threshold, we'll go back to the location plant manager or someone who's knowledgeable about that asset and ask more questions because we know that's a high dollar in value. So you're concentrating on like that 80% of value and those big pieces of machinery, because that's where the dollars are.
Great. We're going to keep it going as long as we can, but if we don't get to your question, we will be happy to email you directly with an answer, because I don't know that we're going to have time here to get to everybody left. But let's go to this one from Elizabeth. What is the average price per square foot for Class A office space and storefront retail space? Is there a chart we can access with basic reference points?
As Ray said, you can use kind of a Marshall and Swift estimate. I mean, that's kind of the industry standard in insurance. They have that Class A office space. And then basically what you want to do is break it up into office space versus the retail space. And then you would use those dollars per square foot. I would say a typical office is probably that $240, $280 a square foot, around there. And again, it depends on your location, because, building in the East Coast, or like, let's say New York compared to Florida, is much higher. So you have to take those adjustments into account. But yeah, so basically you can use like a Marshall and Swift or something like that to come up with that dollars per square foot for each type of space.
Let's do one more here from Nancy. Is there a good resource to tell you what property addition to be added to building value versus considered maintenance? Water protecting roof, window treatments, fire alarm security?
Well, Justin, I know you're probably going to have something to say on this, but I know Marshall and Swift, I mean, some of those features are actually included in, when you're doing the valuation on Marshall and Swift, you sometimes can add some of those features to the facility to kind of detail what it is that you have. I don't know about, specifically what the questioner is asking here in terms of certain changes, but certainly, the fit and finish is something that you get to detail. Do you have an HVAC system? Do you have a sprinkler system? Some of those little details can be encompassed in a Marshall and Swift.
And we do that in-house too, as well. As when we create our own models, we try to track it costs X percentage for your roof, X percentage for your finishes, X percentage for the steel frame, or something like that. And when we add in like security or I guess special features, we can kind of come up with a percentage, but it really is on a case-to-case basis of what's there, right? And what you're adding. So for example, like sprinklers are like, I don't know, $6 to $8 a square foot. And it's a small percentage of your building value. The shell building could be like 40%, but again, it really depends on the occupancy of the building. With a manufacturing or warehouse, your shell is most of the value, because you don't have HVAC, or you don't have you don't have finishes, basically.
Sure. Well, everybody else who asked a question, if you didn't get an answer, don't worry. We'll email you with a nice answer. We're happy to have a conversation anytime. And basically that goes for everybody here. If you like to have a conversation with us, talk to any of the panelists, let us know. Our email addresses are right there. And we'll also probably shoot you a note, tomorrow or Monday to follow up. So with that, I just want to say thank you to David, to Ray, to Justin, to the other Justin. And I will kick it back to RIMS Justin right now to close this out. Thanks again, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Jared. RIMS would like to thank Ray Walsh of StarTech and David Ricks and Justin Chen and Jared Shelley of TÜV SÜD Global Risk Consultants for their time and expertise. A copy of this webinar will be on the on-demand events page of rims.org within a few business days. For more information about TÜV SÜD, you can visit tuvsud.com. And folks, public registration is open for RiskWorld 2023, which will be held in Atlanta, Georgia, April 30th through May 3rd. We are delighted that TÜV SÜD will be at booth 841, and they will be sponsoring the global studio, so they will certainly have a presence. Continue to broaden your risk knowledge with TÜV SÜD and RIMS at RiskWorld. Visit rims.org/events or rims.org/riskworld to register, and tell TÜV SÜD you saw them on this webinar. Make them feel like celebrities. We want to see you there. RIMS is global, and we'd love for you to build your network with us. Visit rims.org/membership to apply for a RIMS membership. Thank you all. This was a great session. Stay safe.